Hey, what's going on, everybody? Excuse me. So, today we're going to. I wanted to do this, right? So, there's some other side characters in the Blonde Ghost Network, and for consistency reasons, I am going to put an E after Blonde. I was using more of the British way of spelling blonde, I guess. But anyways, the Blonde Ghost bio. So there's two characters or three characters I wanted to talk about, and this will be a pretty quick video as well. But they're kind of important characters to keep the story going along about Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple about how they sold C4 explosives to the Libyans in the late to mid 70s and early 80s. So there's a lady, her name is Roberta Jean Barnes, and she was actually the mistress of one of the many mistresses allegedly of Edwin Wilson, who was a rogue CIA contractor, agent, what have you, who sold C4 RDX explosives to Gaddafi in the late 70s and other weapons with his accomplice Frank Turple and many other supporting characters. So it was kind of fascinating, just hearing about this mistress, and her name is Roberta Jean Barnes, right? So let me read this for you. So Roberta Jean Barnes was 33 years of age in 1981, and she was a mistress of Edwin Wilson, who did office management and bookkeeping for his London and Geneva offices. She was arrested in December of 1981 in Dallas, Texas, flying home from London for under-declaring $50 out of $5,000. She was held in jail but released on bond with her father, retired Lieutenant Colonel Leo Bradley, and her brother-in-law, Ron Wamstead, an Austin lawyer. Her bond was reduced from $500,000 to $200,000, and she was able to see her 10-year-old son. So this is from the New York Times article titled "Witness in Wilson Case Freed," published 26 December 1981. And this just kind of invokes a lot of images in my brain, right? Of I hate to say it, but like a lot of like 1980s movies, right? And let's just even comically speaking, right? Like Kindergarten Cop, right? There was always the kind of trope of, let's just be real, the kind of secretary, single mom. This was a very common trope in 1980s media, right? You saw it in Child's Play, you saw it in Kindergarten Cop, you saw it in a lot of movies where you kind of saw the media of Hollywood for the first time showing almost, you can almost say, kind of like quasi third wave feminism taking hold, of where you kind of saw the aftermath of like the working woman, but then also like the aftermath of like no fault divorce, the fallout of the free love swinger keys in the fishbowl swinging culture of the 70s, right? As typified in movies such as Ang Lee's The Ice Storm, which is actually a really good movie, has Christina Ricci in it. But I'm just kind of invoking images in your brain here, right? So in the 1980s, you had a lot of the single mom was a very burgeoning archetype character in media and everything like that, right? Probably working in some sort of corporate environment, right? Or also think about Look Who's Talking, right? You basically have a working woman professional, has a one night stand, gets pregnant, right? So you start, and I'm not saying that's in a bad way, but for whatever reason, when I was first reading about Roberta Jean Barnes, I was really thinking about as a character, if it were on film or on screen, something of that nature, a little bit like. But we'll read more about her, but it's just very fascinating, this whole notion of like the 1980s single mom, basically, right? Where like in Kindergarten Cop, she's fleeing some crazy ex or something like that. Who in that film he as a character he probably would have been one of the minions in this Blonde Ghost Network or something that I'm talking about with Edwin Wilson, right? Just some psychopath. But also, like, films like Child's Play or whatnot, you don't see the father figure at all. But then also films like Look Who's Talking with Christy Allen, right? Even though she has a one night stand with this stranger or something, he becomes a father figure in her child's life, and they kind of develop a relationship leading to sequels. So I know that's kind of a little side tangent character, but to kind of invoke in your brain more images, I just want to insert some of that commentary. Um, anyways, another quote here we have is she was twice divorced by the time of her arrest, had been working with Wilson for at least 2 years prior, and helped Wilson get away from a London airport, right? So think about that, right? So she's more on the troubled side here, right? So for whatever reason, I haven't been able to find any pictures of her. But she was 33, so pretty young, in 1981, but she was twice divorced. So we're dealing with a person who doesn't necessarily have the best choice in relationships here. And for a person like Edwin Wilson, who seems to be able to find the weaknesses in people and exploit them, for men and women, it seems that she was kind of like prime pickings for Wilson. However, I think in her naivety, or whatever naivete, um, is that I think that Wilson kind of found a little sense of solace in her, even with her, let's just say, probably. I have this assumption that she probably wanted the finer things in life. She was dealing with deadbeats, would get into relationships too fast, would get knocked up, or whatnot, or just divorce. She got knocked up eventually. She was kind of finding her way a little bit, and then she finds this older man with financial security, with international contacts, who's able to take her from her Texas upbringing and send her to London and Switzerland, and she's making income, right? I think that in a weird way, her and Edwin Wilson had a very reciprocal relationship. Um, and it kind of invokes a lot of images in my brain, right? It kind of reminds me of a lot of images of the females I would see in, not that I like this person or anything, but Woody Allen films, right? Hannah and her sisters, the hair, the dresses, the argyle sweaters or something, very 1980s type aesthetic going on with her, right? So that quote was from the United Press International and titled Lady of Mystery in a Texas Jail, published December 24th, 1981. So let's keep going here, right? So one of her lawyers, Robert J. Flynn Jr., stated, "She is no Matahari. It's unbelievable she's being represented in that light." So who is Matahari? Matahari was probably one of the original kind of like honeypot, kind of like sexual spies, espionage. I want to say she was maybe a Parisian courtesan or something, who was known for kind of like keeping tabs and spying on people, and I want to say she was maybe executed for espionage at a later date. But so when the lawyer says she's no Matahari, what he's really saying is that she's no genius. She's no real hardcore James Bond like character, right? And that is from the United Press International, published 26 December 1981, titled Roberta Jean Barnes, identified as an associate of fugitive. To keep going to another quote. At one of Wilson's four trials, Roberta, codenamed Wonder Woman in the operation, said that Wilson did send the U.S. government information about Libyan plans to build an atomic bomb, but only after he was already under indictment. Times Magazine, 29 November 1982, in the article titled Gunrunner. So it's very interesting. So she was actually, I think, on the defense. She was a defense witness, right? So she was actually trying to stand up for Edwin Wilson, her lover, and her code name to Wilson in his network was Wonder Woman, right? And what's interesting is that she goes on the stand and says that Wilson was actually giving up information to the CIA, but it's ironic because it was only after he was indicted. You know what I'm saying? So that doesn't necessarily make Wilson look good. Um, in other words, if he were sharing information with the CIA, why would he do it until after he was caught? You know what I'm saying? Unless he was trying to cut a deal. So another quote we have here is Roberta, as a defense witness, stated that while in her presence, that Wilson met in Europe several times in 1978 and 1979 with Thomas G. Kleins, then a high-ranking CIA official, who I want to say was the director of training underneath the Directorate of Operations. Therefore, he answered directly to Theodore Shackley, who therefore answered to William Wells, who therefore answered to then acting Director of Central Intelligence George Bush, who later was replaced by Jimmy Carter's selection, Admiral Stansfield Turner. But William Wells kind of seemed like weak leader who was kind of being controlled probably by people like Theodore Shackley. There's not a lot. That's what it kind of seems to me, at least, from what I can interpret so far. But anyways, Thomas G. Kleins was the director of training, actually. So I guess he ran the farm at the time in the 1970s. And Thomas Kleins was a very corrupt character. I want to say he was one of the only people indicted in the Iran-Contra situation. He actually did receive a pardon from George H.W. Bush, Senior Bush, basically, in the Christmas, what do they call it, the Christmas Massacre or something of that nature, where George Bush, before he left office, after losing to Bill Clinton in the preceding Christmas season, he actually handed out pardons, presidential pardons, to people like Caspar Weinberger, etc., for their involvement in the Iran-Contra situation, in which the Iran-Contra situation actually rubs against what I'm calling the Blonde Ghost Network. In other words, Edwin Wilson selling C4 to Libya, and Frank Turple assisting in that, but also selling other armaments to terrorist organizations across the globe, spanning the Red Brigade in Italy, the IRA in Ireland, um, I think it's Baden Meinhof or Bader Meinhof in Germany, the Palestinian Liberation Organization with factions like Abu Nidal, who was actually being overseen by Gaddafi's intelligence chief. I want to say his name is Abdullah Hajaji. It goes on and on, right? The Japanese communist, right, left, it didn't matter. Neo-Nazi on the far right, communist, they sold weapons to. So, regardless, right? So Thomas G. Kleins, and a high-ranking CIA official, and Major General Richard Secord of the Air Force, a high-ranking Defense Department official, she did not describe the subject matter. She had once seen Mr. Kleins with a list of Soviet equipment. In 1978, she and another Wilson employee delivered the list to Mr. Wilson in Geneva. She said Miss Barnes, who was the bookkeeper and later the manager of Mr. Wilson's London office, testified that he had been paid more than 20 million by the Libyan government under contracts to supply 5,000 M16 rifles, personal supplies, and technological assistance in Libya. So, so she was the bookkeeper and later manager of Wilson's London office, and testified that he had been paid more than $20 million by the Libyans to furnish 5,000 M16s, personal supplies, and technical assistance. Right? So very interesting. And what's interesting is that, so she says that Mr. Klein's came with a list of Soviet equipment, right? So there's a lot of ambiguity as to whether or not the CIA knew what Wilson was doing, but it looks like they did, because Thomas Kleins and Thomas Shackley both knew what Wilson was up to. Um, because they didn't leave the agency until like the late 70s, or like the late 70s, right? Way after Edwin Wilson had like sold C4 to the Libyans. And the more that I'm thinking about it now, I'm starting to think that there's no truth among thieves. So think about this. So Thomas Kleins, separately, in another transaction with Edwin Wilson, Edwin Wilson ended up fronting $500,000 as one of, I think, four or five silent partners in an organization that Thomas Kleins was setting up in like the Bahamas or something, or Bermuda, right? Some sort of shell corporation. I think it was like IRT, maybe it was EATSCO. some sort of, I want to say, if my memory is correct, it was some sort of organization in which, after the Camp David Accords, Egypt was allowed to receive U.S. military equipment. So a lot of these CIA guys tried to get in on the game as contractors to sell the Egyptians military equipment. And as a silent partner, Edwin Wilson, amongst others, invested $500,000 each into an organization that Kleins was setting up. But I want to say, for whatever reason, there was a fallout between Kleins and Wilson, so much so that Wilson sent an ex-Green Beret, Eugene Tafoya, who was recruited by Patry Loomis, ex-CIA person, liaison officer, fired by Stansfield Turner himself. Wilson sent this Tafoya guy to basically go pat down Kleins for his $500,000 back, right? So we know that Wilson went down in 1984. He was convicted and sentenced to about 50 plus years in federal prison, in which he ended up serving about 20 years. But it's so weird to me. I'm starting to think, is did Thomas Kleins like Thomas Kleins, because of being intimidated by Edwin Wilson or something, were they also kind of entrapping Wilson as well, because he was salty about having to give back the $500,000 that Wilson wanted? You know what I'm saying? And that's what I'm saying. There's no truth amongst thieves in these things, right? And also makes me think that because Thomas G. Kleins, who kind of seems like a very unscrupulous character, like a very scumbag, cowardly character who just enjoyed the chaos and the power of having a role in the CIA at this time in the 70s and 80s. It makes me think too that since he had no friends by the end of the 1980s, that he didn't actually receive a pardon from George Bush because of the POS he probably was. Because he probably helped throw Edwin Wilson under the bus, even though Edwin Wilson wasn't a good person himself. This is because Edwin Wilson is a person who was literally heard on wiretap conversations, hiring a hitman to kill his wife, Barbara Wilson, and literally told the alleged hitman to cut off her finger and take her wedding ring because the diamond, was probably worth more than the hit on her life. So we're not dealing with like savory characters here. You know what I'm saying? So it's just very interesting that Klein still working for the CIA, and then Roberta Jean Barnes is saying that they were exchanging information about hopefully getting Soviet equipment, but all of a sudden, why is Edwin Wilson the only one who went down? You know what I'm saying? Like, Thomas Kleins would have known that Edwin Wilson was doing business in Libya, but Wilson is the only one who went down by the federal prosecutors, right? For being the facilitator of the weapons and the shipment, sure. But it seems like the CIA, they weren't stopping him. It's one of those things of like, well, sure, we didn't tell him to do it, but we weren't going to stop him. So is that a crime or not a crime? And that's where you start getting in the moral ambiguity. It's like the devil, right? It's like the devil doesn't tell you to kill somebody. The devil doesn't tell you to do something, antisocial or morally wrong. It's on you. He just encourages you to do it, or he or she encourages you to do it. And it seemed like that's the role of Kleins and Shackley onto Ed Wilson, right? Devils amongst devils, thieves amongst thieves. So, regardless, right? So Taylor Jr. Stewart, 17 November 1982, first Wilson trial goes to jury, the New York Times. So in February 1979, $500,000 was sent to Bermuda in two installments. Later, Wilson confined to his mistress, Roberta J. Barnes, whose code name in the Wilson organization was Wonder Woman, that his unnamed partners were Klein, Shackley, the Pentagon's Eric von Marbod, and General Secord. The $500,000, he said, was seed money for a company that would make millions shipping arms to Egypt. So earlier in January 11th, 1979, Thomas Clines met in Geneva with Wilson's attorney, Edward Coughlin. Clines had resigned from the CIA, and Shackley would do so shortly. Clines has set up a company specializing in security and was about to form another one to be incorporated in Bermuda. In both firms, Clines was the president and Shackley would be listed as consultant. In Geneva, Clines presented Coughlin with a handwritten summary of a loan proposal. Among its points was that a Liberian corporation not identified with Wilson would transfer money to a custodial account in Bermuda. If I understand correctly, Coughlin wrote Wilson in a January 18 memo, it is proposed that an offshore corporation be organized with eventually five equal shareholders. Both of these 20% shareholders are individual U.S. citizens, and the fifth would be a foreign corporation not controlled by U.S. persons. So, and that's from Selling Out Peter Moss there. So interesting. So Peter Goulding. So okay, so that's really about all the stuff I have on her, on Roberta Barnes, right? So that's very interesting. Let me do something here. Very, very interesting. So like all the it gets kind of confusing with all the shell companies these guys are creating, right? So it's like that's very wild here. So a Liberian corporation would transfer money to a custodial account in Bermuda. So they were setting up even corporations in Liberia, which is wild to think. Because I mean, Liberia is not a stable country, but I'm sure in a weird way, it does have an X relationship with the United States. It was basically a country created by the United States for freed slaves, and we know they had all sorts of civil wars and all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of crazy to think that like, do we are corporations using Liberia as a almost like an offshore haven in a sense? And because of the conflict zone cover of it, because it's such a dangerous place or was a dangerous place that like nobody's ever gonna really go there to go audit anything. So then you have a Liberian corporation transferring money to Bermuda, another known tax haven, right? Just like the Isle of Man, just like the city of London, just like Panama. You know what I'm saying? It goes on and on and on. Um, wow. So that's Roberta Barnes, right? And like I said, this is where Eugene Tafoya comes into the play because that $500,000, real quick, let me do something here real quick. Okay, so make sure my volume's good. Okay, so here's another one. So Peter Mass in Selling Out: How an Ex-CIA Agent Made Millions Working for Gaddafi. So by the spring of 1980, Wilson was an indicted fugitive and thus unable to operate from his usual bases in the United States, Britain, and Switzerland. Holed up in Libya, he sent a former Green Beret to warn Clines that he wanted his $500,000 back or else. He eventually, eventually he was repaid. The same Green Beret, Eugene A. Tafoya, was dispatched by Wilson on a request from Hajaji to assassinate a dissident Libyan student in Colorado. The student, although blinded in one eye, survived. Tafoya was apprehended and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for assault and criminal conspiracy. In explaining why Tafoya had escaped conviction on charges of attempted murder, one juror cited confusion over Tafoya's claim that he had been working for the CIA. So there's that. So very interesting. So yeah, so another character that I want to get to is a person named Peter Goulding, right? And Peter Goulding is interesting because I thought he was just some like office worker, but in some more research, I end up discovering that he was actually an active duty U.S. Army captain. So Edwin Wilson was able to even kind of manipulate and loop in an U.S. Army captain, right? Which is not necessarily out of the ordinary because you've got to think about that, um, Oliver North was active duty military with the U.S. Marines, and he was on loan with the NSA and everything when he was doing his stuff with the Iran Contra or whatnot. So how that whole relationship between Wilson and Golding developed, not 100% sure. But regardless, a United States Army captain who linked up with German shipper owner Wolfgang Steiniger to store explosives. A former assistant to Wilson testified that Wilson had threatened to kill Golding's wife if Golding returned to the U.S. and cooperated with investigators. Golding entertained the jury with vivid description of Wilson's childlike delight when, after a 2 year effort, he managed to sneak an M16 into Libya. Time magazine, uh, Gunrunner. So, and also per Douglas Schlachter, Golding was akin to a procurement person. And I heard that in some audio clips with Douglas Valentine. Um, so another source about Golding is Deligny Robert Deligny, published 17 January 1984, West German convicted in Wilson explosives case. Associated Press, Rotterdam, Netherlands. So Golding worked with Wolfgang Steiniger, a West German owner of shipping company Westship, um, where he stored 1,000 pounds of explosives in Rotterdam based on direction from Peter Golding. Peter Golding may have become an author in later life. Another thing I got was from a casetext.com snippet in which Peter Golding, another Wilson employee, testified that it was standard practice for Wilson in dealing with the Libyans to inflate prices 30 to 100%. In closing, the government stated that Wilson ended up with 20 to 22 million from his contracts, in other words, with the Libyans. Wow. So yeah, that's very interesting, right? So, like I said, this one's kind of a quicker one, and so yeah, so he had so Wilson had this mistress, 33 years of age in 1981, which would have meant she was way younger. She was actually younger in 1976 and 1977 when the C4 was being shipped, and a lot more of the intimate relations with the Libyans between the Wilson network and the Blonde Ghost network was going on, right? So that's very interesting. So very young, very impressionable. Um, and let me pause real quick. Actually, hey, so I just paused just to do some Google searching, and I'm not sure if this is the person, but what's interesting is that there is a Peter Golding out there. Not sure if this is the same person. Um, I think they meant to say Liberty University. Interesting, but interesting. And what's interesting is that if the dates probably would have made somewhat sense, right? So Northeastern University, Boston, Massachusetts, and graduated in 1972. And you got to think that the heyday of the Blonde Ghost Network that I'm talking about with Edward Wilson was like 1976 through probably like 1980. So you got to think too is that he possibly could have been a captain in the U.S. military, or a younger officer in the military in the late 70s. By the time he went to trial, he could have been a captain unless he did something like the reserves while or something while he some sort of the military has special programs where like you can be a reservist officer while you finish your degree and then you roll over into active duty. So it's very possible that this could be the guy. Um, Hmm, interesting. American Legion, China Post. So, like I said, I'm not trying to throw this person under the bus, or even if this were the Peter Golding person, it's a long time ago. It is what it is. You know what I'm saying? I'm not here to indict anybody, but very interesting. But from Saint Ignace, uh, which is up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, so it kind of seems like a kind of nice place if that's where he's from. So there's a really big Native American Native American population up there. So that's very interesting. So they still got a presence up there. Okay. Um, but regardless, this is let me see here. Actually, let me do something last time. Actually, I always thought I was gonna see something different because I think he may have published some books or something like that. This Peter Golding guy, but Peter Golding. Let me see here. U.S. Army. Okay, so I'm not saying that this is him, but what's interesting is that there is a book out there that kind of relates to the military. So this may be by him. I'm not sure, but it's called "The Hero, the Widow, and the Army Pensions Board: A Biography of George and Margaret um, George Hegan" by Peter Golding. Actually got positive reviews. So yeah, it's actually out there. So I think that he could have been just some army officer, got caught up overseas with Wilson, helping him, thinking that he was maybe working on some CIA thing or something. Um, Maybe Max, I'm not 100% sure. Max separates at the rank of major and then gets out and kind of lives his life. If this is the Golding in the LinkedIn page, who I think it is, if it is him, he seems to be working on his PhD in education. And if this book is by him, he potentially wrote a book about the Army Pension Board or whatnot. So, and is living somewhere in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But once again, like I said, not trying to indict anybody after the fact, just very fascinating. And this is just another chapter of the Blonde Ghost Network. So I'm going to end it right there. All right, thank you. All right, bye.